how a 30-foot paper balloon flew 5,000 miles to strike the U.S.? It sounds like a fabrication, a myth born from the fog of war. Yet, in the desperate, dying days of the Second World War, it became a terrifying reality. Imagine a weapon that makes no sound. It has no engine. It has no pilot. It is constructed not of high-tensile steel or aluminum, but of paper and potato paste. Yet, this fragile sphere was designed to traverse the vast, freezing void of the Pacific Ocean, riding a mysterious atmospheric current that few understood, to deliver fire and death to the heart of the American mainland. While the world's eyes were fixed on the bloody beaches of Normandy and the brutal island-hopping campaigns of the Pacific, the Imperial Japanese Army unleashed the world's first intercontinental weapon system. It was a silent invasion. Between late 1944 and early 1945, thousands of these ghostly spheres drifted over the chaotic waters of the Pacific, bypassing the mightiest navy in history, to descend upon the forests and farms of the Pacific Northwest. This is not a story of massive tank battles or thundering bomber fleets. This is the story of a silent, invisible siege. It is the story of a tragedy in the quiet woods of Oregon, of a geological detective story that saved countless lives, and of a desperate gamble by an empire on the brink of collapse. This is the story of the Fugo balloon bomb. To understand how a paper balloon became a strategic threat, we must first transport ourselves back to the darkened mindset of the Japanese Imperial High Command in 1944. The war was turning irrevocably against them. The United States had breached the absolute defense perimeter. The loss of Saipan in July 1944 had brought the Japanese home islands within range of the terrifying B-29 superfortress bombers. For the Japanese people, the war was no longer a distant abstraction. It was raining fire upon their wooden cities. The military leadership, humiliated by the Doolittle raid of 1942 and now battered by relentless aerial bombardment, sought a way to strike back at the American mainland. They needed a weapon of vengeance. They needed to show the American public that their homes were not safe, that the ocean was no longer a shield. However, the Imperial Japanese Navy had been decimated. Their aircraft carriers were sinking, and their submarines were hunted to extinction. A conventional invasion of the U.S. West Coast was a tactical impossibility. They lacked the heavy bombers capable of a round-trip flight across the 5,000-mile expanse of the Pacific. But they possessed a secret weapon, one that was not mechanical, but meteorological. Decades prior, a Japanese meteorologist named Wasaburo Oishi had discovered a powerful stream of air flowing high above the Earth, moving from west to east at incredible speeds. Today, we know this as the jet stream. In the 1940s, it was a phenomenon largely unknown to the Western Allies. The Japanese military realized that if they could harness this river of wind at 30,000 feet, they could bypass their lack of fuel and aircraft. Under the command of Major General Tsuyoshi Kusaba of the 9th Army Technical Research Laboratory, the project was codenamed Fugo. The concept was deceptively simple. Launch a hydrogen-filled balloon from the beaches of Honshu, let it rise into the jet stream, and allow the winds to carry it 5,000 miles across the ocean in approximately 3 to 4 days. Once over North America, a timer would release incendiary and anti-personnel bombs. The engineering challenges, however, were immense. The balloon had to survive the journey through the upper atmosphere, where temperatures dropped to minus 50 degrees Celsius. Rubber became brittle and shattered in such cold. The solution was found in traditional Japanese craftsmanship. They would use washi, a durable paper derived from the kozo bush, laminated together with konnyaku paste, a starch derived from devil's tongue root. Mobilization was total. Across Japan, in large theaters and sumo halls requisitioned for the war effort, thousands of teenage schoolgirls were drafted into the production line. With no knowledge of what they were building, these young women spent 12-hour shifts pasting layers of paper together, their fingers numb and raw from the harsh adhesive. They were told only that they were building a weapon to defeat the Americans. By late 1944, the weapon was ready. It was 32 feet in diameter, holding 19,000 cubic feet of hydrogen. Suspended beneath it was a sophisticated aluminum chandelier carrying sandbags for ballast and a payload of incendiary devices. The stage was set for the longest-range bombing mission in the history of warfare. The offensive began in early November 1944. On the eastern coast of Honshu, at sites like Nakoso and Ichinomiya, specialized launch crews waited for the cover of dusk. The operation demanded precise weather conditions, specifically the high-pressure patterns that fueled the winter jet stream. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the launch sites became hives of frantic, disciplined activity. The massive envelopes of paper were laid out, and hydrogen gas hissed into them, swelling the spheres until they tugged violently at their restraints. At the command of release, hundreds of balloons ascended into the twilight, rising rapidly to catch the airstream at 30,000 feet. Once aloft, the balloon became an autonomous machine. The genius of the Fugo weapon lay in its altitude control system. As the balloon traveled through the day, the sun would heat the hydrogen, causing it to expand and the balloon to rise. If it rose too high, the pressure would burst the paper envelope. To counter this, a relief valve vented gas. Conversely, at night, the cold would cause the gas to contract, and the balloon would sink toward the ocean. If it dropped below 30,000 feet, it would fall out of the jet stream and be lost. To prevent this, a battery-operated altimeter, an aneroid barometer, monitored the height. When the balloon dropped too low, the system triggered a small explosive charge, cutting loose 2 aluminum sandbags. The loss of weight allowed the balloon to rise back into the air current. This cycle of rising and falling, venting gas and dropping ballast would repeat for 3 days as the balloon surfed the winds at speeds exceeding 100 miles per hour. By the time the balloon reached the North American continent, the sandbags would be gone. The final gears in the mechanism would then release the deadly payload, usually one 15-kilogram high-explosive anti-personnel bomb and 4 5-kilogram thermite incendiary bombs. The first sign of the attack on American soil was confusion. On November 4, 1944, a U.S. Navy patrol craft off the coast of California spotted a large, ragged cloth floating in the water. They retrieved it, finding Japanese markings, but dismissed it as debris. 2 weeks later, pieces of another balloon were found in the ocean off Hawaii. Then, the reports started coming from inland. In December, coal miners in Wyoming witnessed a parachute drifting down into the mountains. In Montana, a burst of flame in the night sky startled residents near Kalispell. The sightings were sporadic and bizarre. Strange jellyfish-like objects floating silently against the clouds, mysterious explosions in remote forests. By January 1945, the Office of Naval Intelligence and the FBI began to piece together the impossible truth. They recovered fragments of the mechanism near Thermopolis, Wyoming. The markings were clear. The craftsmanship was undeniable. These were not weather balloons gone astray. They were weapons of war, arriving in the American heartland. The sheer scale of the threat was terrifying to the strategic planners in Washington. It wasn't just the explosives. The payload capacity of the Fugo balloons was small, but the delivery system was effective. The fear that gripped the War Department was not about 15 kilograms of TNT. It was about what else those balloons could carry. Biological warfare. Intelligence reports had long suggested that Japan was experimenting with plague, anthrax, and other pathogens at the infamous Unit 731. If a single balloon, drifting silently over Los Angeles or Seattle, dropped a canister of plague-infected fleas instead of an incendiary bomb, the result would be catastrophic. The panic alone could paralyze the war effort. Furthermore, the timing was critical. The balloons were arriving during the winter months, but as spring approached, the forests of the Pacific Northwest would dry out. If thousands of incendiary devices dropped into the timberlands of Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia during the dry season, they could ignite massive wildfires, diverting crucial manpower and resources away from the war. By 1400 hours, on dozens of days, in early 1945, pilots flying over the western United States began reporting unidentified floating objects. P-38 Lightnings and P-61 Black Widows were scrambled to intercept. It was a surreal form of aerial combat. The fighter planes, designed to fly at 300 miles per hour, struggled to engage stationary targets, drifting at 30,000 feet. Pilots had to make high-speed passes, firing bursts of machine gun fire, hoping to puncture the gas envelope without colliding with the debris. Despite the interceptions, the balloons kept coming. They were found in Alaska, Washington, Oregon, California, Arizona, Idaho, Montana, Utah, Wyoming, Colorado, Texas, Kansas, Nebraska, North Dakota, South Dakota, Iowa, Michigan, and even as far east as Michigan. The invasion was widespread, erratic, and silent, and for months the U.S. government managed to keep it a total secret. But secrecy has a price. The crisis of the Fugo campaign was defined by a terrifying paradox. To save the population, the government had to keep them in the dark. The Office of Censorship, led by Byron Price, issued a strict directive to newspapers and radio stations across the West Coast. No mention of balloons, no reports of strange explosions, no speculation about the source of forest fires. The logic was cold but sound. If the Japanese learned where the balloons were landing, they could adjust their launch timing and ballast calculations to target specific cities. If they heard nothing, they would assume the project was a failure. But silence left the civilians vulnerable. They had no idea that walking in the woods or farming their land now carried the risk of encountering a lethal booby trap from across the ocean. This policy of silence held until tragedy struck on May 5, 1945. It was a Saturday morning in south-central Oregon. The location was Gerhardt Mountain, near the small town of Bly. The war in Europe was practically over. Hitler was dead, and Berlin had fallen. But here, under the pine trees of Oregon, the war was about to claim its only combat casualties on the continental U.S. mainland. Reverend Archie Mitchell, the young pastor of the Christian and Missionary Alliance Church, had organized a picnic. It was a beautiful spring day. He drove his pregnant wife, Elsie Mitchell, and 5 children from their Sunday school class up into the mountains. The children were Jay Gifford, Edward Engen, Sherman Shoemaker, Dick Patska, and Joan Patska. Archie parked the sedan on a logging road. As he began to unload the lunch baskets and fishing gear from the trunk, Elsie and the children ran ahead into the woods, exploring the terrain. Moments later, one of the children shouted back, "Look what we found! It looks like a balloon." Archie, still by the car, felt a knot of dread, but didn't know why. He shouted, "Don't touch it! Stay away!" But it was too late. The balloon had likely been grounded there for weeks, deflated and draped over the brush. The disturbance, perhaps a kick, perhaps just tugging at the strange material, triggered the anti-handling mechanism or the remaining payload. A massive explosion ripped through the silence of the forest. Archie ran toward the smoke. He found a scene of devastation. The blast had been lethal. His wife, Elsie, her dress on fire, was dying. The 5 children lay scattered around the crater, killed instantly or mortally wounded. Archie Mitchell frantically used his hands to put out the flames on his wife's clothing, but she died in his arms. In a split second, a picnic had turned into a massacre. 6 civilians, a pregnant woman, and 5 children lay dead on American soil, killed by a weapon launched 6 months earlier from a beach 5,000 miles away. Local forest rangers arrived quickly, followed by military personnel. The scene was immediately locked down. The grief-stricken community was confused and angry, but the veil of secrecy descended instantly. The bodies were removed, and the families were told initially that it was an explosion of unknown origin. This was the darkest moment of the balloon offensive. The theoretical threat had become bloodily real. The military realized that thousands of these unexploded bombs were potentially lying in the tall grass, in the backwoods, and near hiking trails across half the continent. The danger wasn't just the explosion, it was the randomness. There was no front line. The front line was everywhere. A farmer plowing his field in Nebraska, a logger in Washington, a child playing in a park in Oregon. Anyone could be the next victim. Little did they know, the Japanese had launched over 9,000 of these balloons. Current estimates suggested only a few hundred had been found. Where were the rest? The death of the Mitchell Party forced the U.S. government's hand. They could no longer maintain total silence. The risk to the public was too great. On May 22, 1945, the War Department issued a carefully worded statement detailing the existence of the Japanese balloon bombs. They warned the public not to touch any strange objects found in the wilderness. This public education campaign, though late for Elsie Mitchell and the 5 children, undoubtedly saved lives in the months that followed. But the true turning point, the victory over the Fugo offensive, didn't come from a fighter pilot's gun sight or a public service announcement. It came from a microscope. The U.S. military needed to stop the launches at the source. But where exactly were these balloons coming from? Japan is a long archipelago. Bombing the entire coastline was impossible. They needed precise coordinates. Enter the Military Geology Unit of the U.S. Geological Survey. When the balloons were recovered, intelligence officers found the sandbags used for ballast. To the untrained eye, it was just sand. To Colonel Sidman Poole and his team of geologists, it was a fingerprint. The sand from the ballast bags was sent to a laboratory for forensic analysis. The geologists examined the mineral composition and the microfossils, specifically the diatoms present in the sand. They found a unique mixture of minerals, hypersthene, augite, and hornblende, but critically, no quartz. They also identified specific species of mollusks and foraminifera. This specific geological cocktail did not exist just anywhere. It pointed to a beach with volcanic origin, recent geological activity, and specific fossil beds. The team cross-referenced this data with geological maps of Japan pre-war. They narrowed the potential launch sites down from thousands of miles of coastline to just 2 specific beaches on the east coast of Honshu, Ichinomiya and Otsu. It was a masterstroke of scientific deduction. Armed with this information, the U.S. Army Air Forces directed B-29 reconnaissance aircraft to photograph these specific areas. The photos confirmed the presence of large hydrogen production facilities and launch pads. The targets were marked. The B-29 seconds, firebombing Japanese cities, now included these specific hydrogen plants on their target lists. They struck the production facilities of the Showa Denko Company and other chemical plants supplying the hydrogen. Simultaneously, the defensive Firefly project was deployed in the U.S. This involved the 555th Parachute Infantry Battalion, the Triple Nickels, an all-black airborne unit. They were trained as smoke jumpers to parachute into remote forest fires, started by the balloons, and extinguish them before they could spread. They stood ready to disarm the bombs and contain the damage. But the most effective weapon remained the silence that had preceded the tragedy. Back in Japan, General Kusaba and his team were listening to American radio and reading American newspapers. They were waiting for reports of panic, of massive fires, of explosions. They heard nothing. Because of the censorship, the Japanese estimated that the balloons were not reaching America. They believed the jet stream calculations were wrong, or the balloons were failing over the ocean. In reality, hundreds had arrived, but the Japanese High Command thought the campaign was a total failure. Facing dwindling resources, the destruction of their hydrogen plants by the targeted B-29 raids, and the apparent lack of results, the Japanese Army ordered the cessation of the Fugo project in April 1945. The last balloon was launched just weeks before the tragedy in Bly, Oregon. The offensive ended not with a bang, but with a bureaucratic order, driven by the belief that the weapon had failed. The war ended in August 1945. As American occupation forces entered Japan, they interviewed the scientists and generals behind the Fugo project. Only then did the sheer scale of the operation become clear. Japan had launched approximately 9,300 balloons. The U.S. authorities had confirmed roughly 300 sightings or recoveries. Mathematical models suggest that perhaps 1,000 actually reached North America. That meant hundreds of unexploded bombs were potentially still lying in the remote wilderness of the American West. The legacy of the Fugo balloon is a chilling reminder of how technology shrinks the world. It was the first intercontinental weapon system, a precursor to the ICBMs that would define the Cold War. It proved that the oceans were no longer a guarantee of safety. But the human cost remains the most poignant part of this history. In 1950, a monument was erected at the site of the explosion in the Fremont National Forest. It is the only place on the continental United States dedicated to Americans killed by enemy action during World War II. It stands as a solemn marker of the Mitchell Monument. The victims, Elsie Mitchell, J. Gifford, Edward Engen, Sherman Shoemaker, Dick Patsky, and Joan Patsky, were casualties of a war that had supposedly been thousands of miles away. For decades after the war, remains of the balloons continued to be found. In the 1950s, 60s, and even as recently as 2014 in British Columbia, hikers and forestry workers have stumbled upon the rusted remains of the altitude control mechanisms. The Fuggo project was a failure in a tactical sense. It did not burn down the American West, nor did it alter the course of the war, but as a feat of engineering and a psychological weapon, it was terrifyingly ahead of its time. It demonstrated that, with enough ingenuity and desperation, an enemy could strike from the other side of the world, riding the very winds of the earth. History has a terrifying habit of punishing those who forget it. The Fuggo balloons were a silent threat that drifted overhead while the world looked elsewhere, and it cost innocent lives. Today, we are surrounded by new silent threats, and the only defense we have is knowledge. Those who ignore the lessons of the past are destined to be the victims of the future's surprise. Do not let yourself become a casualty of ignorance. Click subscribe right now. Don't hesitate. Don't think twice. Secure your understanding of history before it repeats itself. And if you are brave enough or foolish enough to turn a blind eye to these warnings, go down to the comments section and explain exactly why you think you are safe ignoring the past. We're waiting to hear your excuse. The silence of the Oregon woods has long since returned, covering the scars of that May morning. But the story of the paper balloon serves as a testament to the unpredictable and total nature of modern warfare. This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to WWII Lost Records as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to life.